Good afternoon. I'm your host, Leia Love, and thank you for tuning in to Forum 360, where we have a global outlook from a local view. Today, we are so excited to have Marquita Thatcher. She is the attorney of Taylor Thatcher Law, and we are excited to have her talk about I'm getting a divorce, now what? So a little background about her is that she was admitted to the practice of law in 2002, and now in her retirement, she's decided to make a more tangible difference in the lives of others. Her private practice is dedicated to serving clients with limited financial resources who have traditionally been underserved by the Summit County legal community. Although she is a lawyer, today she is only providing general information, and she is not acting as your lawyer for today. So we want to make that clear. And we want to thank you for joining us, Marquita Thatcher.
Thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
So tell me a little bit about your journey. How did you get on this path, and what made you decide to niche down into this particular area?
Well, I saw a need. I practiced law. I previously practiced labor and employment law also. And I actually saw a need in our community to be able to help people who could benefit from having legal representation in family law matters. Hardworking people who just can't afford to pay market rate for attorneys, but they need someone to help guide them through the system in dealing with issues involving divorce and child custody and visitation/parenting time. And I thought that this would be a good way for me to be able to give back in order to help them and to charge them reasonable rates for representation.
That's awesome, because it's definitely a much needed service, and especially during COVID right now, where people are falling on hard times, but still have to go through these different types of situations. So I want to commend you on that, and thank you for your passion in that area. So tell me, what is family law?
When we talk about family law, we're talking about the area of the law that deals with conflicts in the family relationship, most notably divorce, child custody, child support issues. You can branch off into post-nuptial agreements, prenuptial agreements, also deals with adoption, but most notably divorce matters is what most commonly when you think of family laws is dealing with divorce and child custody issues.
Okay. You focus your clients with limited, modest financial resources. And you said that the client base was basically because of the limited resources that they have. Did you have anything, more in regards to that aspect of why you chose that base?
Yes, because people that have disposable income that can afford to hire an attorney, there's a lot of attorneys out there that will take their case. But when you have people that can't afford to pay what is considered market rate in this area for an attorney, sometimes they either stand still and do nothing, which is not a good idea, or they try to represent themselves, and they may not be their best advocate in the legal system. And when you hire an attorney, you have somebody that is advocating for you, somebody who's knowledgeable of case law, knowledgeable of the code sections that apply in your particular case, and somebody who can take some of the anxiety out of going through this process. And you just need somebody who's willing to do that without charging fees that you can't really afford to pay. So when I established my practice, I looked at using a scale provided by federal guidelines. I use the poverty scale, federal poverty guideline scales, and I take clients all the way up to 250% of the federal poverty guidelines. So just to put that into perspective, if you have a potential client who has 3 children, that's a family of 4, that household income could be up to $65,000 a year, and they would be able to utilize my services.
Great. Thank you for that breakdown for that. So what are some of the steps that someone should take before filing for a divorce?
I have a 10-point process that I think people should go through before they actually file for the divorce. And just in the interest of time, I'll hit a couple of those that I think are important. One is to determine whether you need a counselor or a therapist to help you through the process. One thing that you don't want to do is use your lawyer for that part of the process. Not that your lawyer would not care, but that can get expensive because your lawyer more than likely is charging you by the hour. So you don't want to use them as the vehicle to to vent your frustrations about your soon-to-be spouse. You should determine whether you're really going to need a good girlfriend or a guy friend or a therapist or a counselor for that part of the process. Also, you'll definitely want to get your paperwork in order before you file for divorce so that you have access to the things that you'll need. You'll want to have your financial statements, bank account statements. You'll want to have, if you have investments, any investment statements. If you have pension fund, you'll want to have your pension statement and those of your spouse. You'll want to have copies of all of those. You'll need 3 years of tax returns available to you. So
You said 3 years?
3 years of tax returns. You want to have your last 3 years of tax returns available to you. These will all be documents that will come in handy later. It'll be good to have copies of recent pay stubs to see whether there's money going into accounts, where the money is going into from the various accounts that both you and your spouse have, if you have money going into other accounts. You'll want to make sure that you have changed your passwords on if your spouse has your passwords to your email or social media accounts, to bank accounts and things like that. You'll want to make sure that those sensitive passwords are changed. So those are a few things just starting out you would want to do before you actually file for that divorce.
Oh. Is there any reason why they want 3 years in particular, or is that just like a suggested type of number?
It is suggested only because it allows us to see, for example, sometimes spouses hide money. It allows us to see, where they might be getting investment income from, where they might be getting 1099s from, because sometimes spouses don't know what other spouses are doing with their money. So it kind of allows us to be able to go back and see whether there's money that's being shuttled somewhere that a spouse doesn't know about. So that gives us a good indication of where to dig if there's money out there that the spouse doesn't know about.
Okay. What are a few ways to reduce your legal fees during the divorce process?
One way, as I mentioned before, is to not use your attorney as your counselor. Attorneys normally charge you by the hour, and they're probably charging you by the 10th of an hour, which are 6-minute increments. So every phone call that you make, you're talking to them about something, you're being billed for that. And so that would be one thing, is try not to use your lawyer as your counselor. Also, to make sure that when you are calling your attorney, that you are writing down your questions, so that when you get your attorney on the phone, if you have 5 questions or you have 6 questions, that you're not wasting time, and you've actually have all your questions that you have right there, and that you're also taking good notes, so that you don't have questions and then you come back 2 weeks later and you call back with the same questions, because you're going to be double billed for that. So you'll just want to make sure that you have a notebook, that you have a place where you're keeping those notes and you're jotting those things down, because it is it's a lengthy process, and it's a very confusing process, and there's a lot of rules around the process. So it's easy for people to think that they have it all, and then when they think back on something, they're like, well, I don't remember if I posed this question or not, or I don't remember what the answer, so let me just pick up the phone real quick and call, and then that's just racking up the meter right there. So that's a couple of ways. Another way would be to know what your positions are and what you're willing to be flexible on. A lot of times the divorce process will take longer and cost more money because people are so entrenched in their positions, and they're not really being reasonable, and they're not being flexible. So that is one way to reduce your fees, is to kind of know what things you're willing to give on and what things really don't mean that much to you, so that when your attorney comes back with a settlement offer, you know what you're willing to modify as far as what you wanted and where you really want to be when this is over with.
If you had to throw out a ballpark range of on the lower end versus the higher end of how much a divorce would cost, what would you say those ballpark ranges could be?
Well, it depends. Some people will file for dissolution, which will be usually an inexpensive way to go if you get a dissolution versus going for the divorce, and that requires both parties to come in and be in agreement on everything. So that would be, if that's a possibility for your situation, that would be a very economical way to dissolve your marriage, is to go with the dissolution. So that might, be in the range of $1,000, let's say. And if you have to go all the way to a divorce, that's going to depend on the contentiousness of your issues. The most expensive divorces are the ones that are considered high conflict divorces, where they're fighting over everything, and everybody's entrenched in their positions. There's also, depends on whether you settle or whether you go to trial. Most divorces settle, you never end up going to trial, but it could take months. Some divorces take a couple of years. It just depends on what your assets are, because that a lot of times can determine how long it takes. If you have a lot of assets, if you have a lot of property, if you have children, that's going to be a whole nother dynamic, because you may be determining who should have custody and what the visitation should be like, and are you going to help with college expenses, and what does that look like? So you could have people paying, tens of thousands of dollars for a divorce, just depending on how intricate their lives are. Did they commingle their assets, or did they get married and they kept their assets separate? All those things determine how long it's going to actually take, that process, and how much it would actually cost.
Okay, so you mentioned about assets. What if one of the spouses has accrued a lot of debt? Are they ordered by the court to repay that? And if they fail to do so, can the creditor seek payments from the other spouse? How does all of that work in between the divorce?
Well, just like the property division, the debt will be divided typically equitably. So what the court is going to look at is what was the reason that debt was accrued. So just because debt is in one person's name, if that debt was accrued for the benefit of the family, then that's going to obviously be something that's going to be considered marital debt, and it will be the court will determine. If the parties can't agree, we always try to go for the parties agreeing how to divide the debt. But if it actually goes to trial and the judge has to make the determination, they're going to look at what was the reason that debt was accrued. They're going to look at how the assets are being divided and what would be an equitable distribution of that debt between the two parties. Okay. And to your second question, if one party is assigned to or ordered to pay debt and they don't, if that debt is in joint names, then the creditor can come after the other spouse, even though that wasn't the spouse that was ordered to pay the debt. There is a agreement that you're going to pay debt when you sign a credit card application, for example, or you sign a car loan. And just because you get divorced and the divorce decree orders spouse number one to pay that debt, that does not abdicate spouse number two from being legally responsible for it, based on the agreement and the contract that they had with the creditor. So the creditor can still come after them.
Okay, that's good to know. What if you are filing for divorce and you cannot locate your spouse? They will not give you an address or a location, but you want to move forward with this. What is the process for that?
Okay, well, it definitely will not keep you from getting a divorce if you can't find your spouse, or they won't accept service or process. But what happens in that case is that you would use their last known address, if you have that, and you would try to serve them that way. If they've moved or you do not have an address, you have to make reasonable efforts to locate them. For example, you have to try social media, you have to try different websites, you have to reach out to their relatives to try to find their address. So you have to make an effort to find their address. If you have been unable to find their address, you can do what is called service by publication, where you're, for example, you would use Akron Legal News in this area, where you would publish that you are seeking a divorce and the date of the hearing, and then that would be published for 6 consecutive times in Akron Legal News, and that would be considered proper service, after it's been published 6 times.
And that has to be in the state, let's say you guys are in different states. That has to be in both states, or in just the state that the person serving the divorce is in?
It should be where you last knew where they were.
Okay.
The area where you last knew them to be.
Okay. One of your practice areas is fathers' rights. Do you feel that fathers have equal rights in the court system?
I think that the court system has come a long way. We've come a very long way from where it was assumed that when there was a divorce, that the mother would get custody of the children and the father would get visitation, which we now call parenting time. Now, the presumption when both parties walk into court is that both parents have equal rights to have custody, and that it is in the best interest of the children to spend equal time with their parents. That's the presumption. Now, it's the rebuttable presumption, which means that the court will consider factors if one parent does not feel like there should be a shared parenting relationship or a joint residential custody, that the court will look at what the reasons that would be. if there's an argument against that. But just walking into the door, fathers do have equal rights to have shared parenting or joint residential custody, and also joint legal custody, of course, of their kids. And the legal custody, the residential custody refers to where the children live, so that they would spend roughly equal time with each parent residing in the homes, whereas legal custody refers to the joint decision making, especially decision making on what they consider the major factors, such as religion, decisions regarding education, and decisions regarding healthcare matters.
Okay. And if you are just tuning in, we are talking to Marquita Thatcher of Taylor Thatcher Law about getting a divorce and what you should do next in that process. Following back up with that, we were talking about fathers' rights. What if the instance is that the child is in an abusive home and one of the parents cannot necessarily prove that this child is in an unsafe environment, but they want to get the divorce and not have the other parent have access? What are their legal rights or legal process steps that they could take to ensure the safety of their child?
Well, one of the main reasons that people lose custody of children would be abuse and or neglect. And the court can order a guardian ad litem, who is a court representative who represents the child's interest. And they would do a full investigation, which would involve going to both of the parents' homes. They would interview both of the parents. They would interview the child. They would interview anyone that they thought it was relevant to hear from, for example, teachers, counselors, if there's been any situations where they need to look at medical records, for example, if the child has been to a healthcare provider. And then they would make a recommendation to the court as to who should have custody of the child. And if the other parent is being abusive or neglectful, whether there should not be any parenting time, whether there should be supervised parenting, and then that would be something that the court would then order. But the first thing to do would definitely be to seek an attorney to help you through that process.
And then also too, with that, maybe they don't have children, but they are in an abusive relationship and they don't want to have any type of contact with their spouse to go through a divorce. Is that still a possibility, or is there going to be a point where they're still going to have to interact with this person to follow through with the divorce?
Well, sometimes when someone is filing a divorce, they don't want their spouse to even know where they live. And in those situations, which I've had clients, I've used my address is to provide to the court, my business address to provide to the court, so that when the other party is served, they don't know their spouse's address and they don't have access to their phone number and email and things like that. So it is definitely possible to go through the process without letting that person know. And your attorney can help you through that. Now, with an uncontested divorce, sometimes the other party, it's called an uncontested divorce because the other party may not even show up. So they may get served with the papers and they may not show up. You may not even see them in court. So the person that's filing for divorce would be the only one there along with their attorney and the judge, and they would go through that uncontested divorce hearing without ever seeing the other side. Sometimes that happens. And sometimes the other side shows up, but they don't object to anything.
Okay.
And the good thing right now is with uncontested divorce hearings, they're actually being done by Zoom, at least here in Summit County.
Okay. Well, that's good. You don't have to go in.
Right.
What is a dissolution of marriage? You spoke about that earlier. And when should someone seek that instead of the divorce? And I think you talked a little bit about that, but if you could just clarify that a little bit more for us.
Well, with the dissolution, both parties join in a petition and they ask to have their marriage dissolved. So instead of it being adversarial, it's actually those two people going in together saying, we are incompatible and we would like to have our marriage dissolved. And what happens is an agreement is drafted up. It's called a separation agreement, and they have to agree on all the major issues. So they have to agree on how to divide their property. They have to agree on how to divide their debt. If they have children, they have to agree on custody and parenting time. If there's spousal support, they have to agree as to whether whether or not there's going to be spousal support, but if there's spousal support, who's going to pay it and how much is going to be paid. So all of those issues they're in agreement on. A separation agreement is drafted for them to sign and review. And basically, when it's time for their hearing, at that point, you're just asking the judge to approve the separation agreement. And then the judge would then basically dissolve the marriage in just one hearing. So it's a way when you have parties who are in agreement on how everything should be resolved, and they're telling the court, we've actually finalized everything, and we don't need you to make any decisions for us. We just need you to do the legal components, which would be to dissolve the marriage, because we've already agreed to everything. And actually, the people who would be good candidates for that would be people who are able to work together, and they don't have those high conflicts. Whatever personal issues they've had, they've actually dealt with those issues, and they're both ready to move on. A lot of times you'll see in dissolutions where the spouses have kept their finances separate, so it's kind of easy to actually say, this is how we should divide this up. This is yours, this is mine. Yes, we agree on that. Obviously, the fewer things that you have together, the easier it is to separate them out when it's time to go your separate ways. So a lot of times you'll see either people who just do not want to have the hassle of going through arguing over pots and pans, or people that have kept their finances separate, so it's easier for them to dissolve.
What are the different types of divorces that you can file for?
Well, you can file for, now when you say different types, are you talking about the grounds for divorce?
So like you said, the dissolution versus separation, what are the different ones and the different candidates, as you were saying?
Okay, so you have the dissolution, and then there are also people who file for legal separation instead of filing for divorce. And there could be reasons that someone would file for a legal separation instead of filing for a divorce. It could be that it's against their religious beliefs to get divorced, but they do want to live separate and apart. And a legal separation would do that. In a legal separation, similar to a divorce, you still divide up assets and you determine how custody and visitation will be handled. You're obviously not living together, but you don't have, you're still legally married. So with a legal separation, you still have to make all those same decisions, but you have a separation instead of a divorce. Sometimes people will do that. It could be religious reasons. It could be that maybe one spouse wants to remain on the other spouse's medical benefits, for example, and they wouldn't be able to do that in a divorce. Now, some companies have caught on to that, and they will not allow you to stay on their medical benefits if you're legally separated, because they figured out that that's something that people will do. So, but that might be a consideration for people.
You said if you're legally separated, they will not let you do that?
Right. So, sometimes they won't let you do that depending on the company. So that may not work in every situation where you're able to be legally separated but still maintain your health insurance through your spouse. And then another reason why someone might want to get legally separated instead of divorce is that they may be close to that 10-year cliff of being able to get Social Security benefits on their spouse's record, because maybe they did not work, and maybe they want to be married for 10 years, because once you're married for 10 years, you can claim Social Security benefits on your working spouse's record when it comes to the time to collect. So that would be another reason why someone will get legally separated, wait for that clock to tick by till they've got 10 years in before they would get divorced.
In our last minute, can you tell me what's been one of the most rewarding parts of your work?
Having people tell me, I'm so glad that you are here to fill this gap, because I could not afford it to pay $250 an hour for an attorney, or $200 for an attorney. I don't have a case that legal aid would be able to take, or maybe I make a little bit too much money for legal aid to help me, and you kind of filling that gap. So that's been the most rewarding, because that was exactly what I wanted to do and exactly why I went into this area. And so that's been very rewarding for me.
And let's say you have a young girl who is looking at you right now and she's like, that's exactly what I want to do. What would your advice be for her?
Well, definitely you have to stay in school. Stay in school, of course. Age-old advice, get good grades, be very studious. You have to enjoy reading. because a lot of what we do is we read code sections, we read statutes, we read case law. So you have to be interested in reading and being able to analyze. You have to be interested in writing, because we do a lot of persuasive writing, which is one of the benefits that we offer to our clients, is that we are taught in law school how to write persuasively. Undergraduate degree doesn't matter quite as much, but you have to stay in school, you have to get your degree, and you have to basically work hard, because law school, especially that first year of law school, is really tough. But it's definitely rewarding, and there's a lot of areas of law to go into. I practiced labor and employment law at one time, and it's easy to segue from one area of the law to the other if you end up developing other interests.
Well, thank you so much for your advice. Thank you so much for your time. And we want to wish you well with your practice, that it continues to survive or thrive. And we know that you're going to be joining the She Suite later on this year and providing classes with that. So we will link your website below so people can reach out to you if they have any additional questions. And I'm your host, Leia Love. Thank you for joining us today with Marquita Thatcher of Taylor Thatcher Law, and have a great week.
Forum 360 is brought to you by John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, the Akron Community Foundation, Hudson Community Television, the Rubber City Radio Group, Shaw Jewish Community Center of Akron, Blue Green, Electric Impulse Communications, and Forum 360 supporters.